I want to share with you some of the experiences we've had with doing field scale research. It's something that I've been involved with for probably about 13 or 14 years. And as a researcher at Purdue, I've pretty much gone away from small plot research. Not that it's bad. I'm not here to bash small plot research. But I'm just saying, for what I do as an extension specialist, working out in the state, trying to work with problems that affect growers, field scale research has really had an impact, I think, for me and my program. And I think it has allowed us to develop guidelines for our growers that are more reliable, more robust, and simply more credible. So I just want to share with you some of the ins and outs of this kind of research, and encourage you all to get involved on your own farm operations. So, again, historically, when we would conduct on-farm research, when I came to Purdue in the early 80s, and I got involved with what I called on-farm research, and what it really consisted of was me going out to a farmer and asking you for maybe 5 acres of ground. I'd bring my plot equipment in, and I'd put out these small plots with my own equipment inside, on a small area inside of your field, and I called that on-farm research. It usually didn't involve much collaboration with the grower other than asking for the piece of ground inside of their field, and the farmer really didn't get much involved other than putting up with the nuisance of us showing up once in a while, going out to the fields to collect data. And of course, back in the day, we didn't have a combine back in the day. And so we were hand harvesting these things, and so there was sort of that silliness involved. And frankly, in terms of the farmers, I think it was more of a logistical nuisance for the farmer to sort of allow us on their farm than it was of any real substance. And so you can see the small plots in this old photo from 1998. These aren't my plots, but they certainly represent the kind of thing that we would do. And this is good. Figure out how to get this attached to something. Oh, come on. Yeah, maybe. And so you can see from the photo that was the extent of what we called on-farm research. And so in terms of field scale research, this is better. Now I can roam. So in terms of field scale research, right, literally we're talking fields. And so for most of our trials, it ranges anywhere from roughly between 30 and 80 acres, captures most of the field trials that we've done. I don't like to go much smaller than 30 acres because using commercial size equipment, you really can't fit many treatments into something less than 30 acres. We've had trials as big as over 400 acres in size, which is, from my perspective as a researcher, that's pretty cool stuff when I can be putting out trials on 400 acres using somebody's 80-foot wide planter and feel like I'm really doing something meaningful. But most of it ranges from 30 to 80 acres. The individual plots within the experiment usually range from 30 to 60 feet wide, so 12-row to 24-row equipment typically, and by length of field. And of course that can range anywhere, and up to a mile long in some cases. We're using commercial farming equipment to put out this kind of research, and of course we're using precision ag technology, and it's that technology that has allowed us to get into this kind of field scale research. And and part of that technology is the ability to design the trial ahead of time with GIS or mapping software, and then after the fact using that same software to analyze the data, something that back in the early 80s I just simply didn't have access to. So if you're wondering why you should get involved with on-farm research, and maybe in particular why should you get involved with the likes of me or someone at OSU, the bottom line is, for your sake, we hope that you learn something that's going to improve yield and profit. And then that's really the simplest reason for you to get involved with on-farm research, to try and learn something that's going to help you in the rest of your operation. From my perspective as a researcher, some of the reasons that I think we need to be involved with field scale research, because we have the precision technologies today that simplify the logistics of the grower to get involved with this kind of research. Because of that, more growers are willing to get involved, especially compared to 30-some years ago. And so the more farmers that get involved conducting field-scale research that supplements similar research we're doing on the Purdue farms, it simply allows us to build a bigger database of data. And when we're trying to develop reliable guidelines for a region of the state or perhaps for the whole state, the more data we have, the more reliable that we can come up with those guidelines. So selfishly, it gives me more data from my database if you play with me by doing a trial on your farm. You learn something, I get your data and build my database, right? So there's value there to me. And frankly, results from field scale research is simply more credible with growers. And because it's more credible with growers, the guidelines that I might develop from this kind of research are more credible. And therefore, since the guidelines are more credible, they're more likely to be adopted by growers. And so for me, it's a win-win situation. I build a database that's larger, I build a database more rapidly, I can develop guidelines more quickly than I used to, and the guidelines are more believable, and hopefully they get used, right? So that's my selfish reason for getting involved with research. And as an extension specialist, I suppose the other selfish reason is that hopefully it makes me look a little more credible to my clientele out in the state. And it definitely gives me opportunity to become familiar with some of the farming technologies today that I otherwise just simply may not have a chance to experience. When you're dealing with small plot equipment, honestly, you just don't always have the whistles and bells that farmers sometimes have in the real world. So, as I said, these precision ag technologies were the key to allowing us to begin to move into this field scale research back in the 2000s. This is an example of one of our nitrogen trials in north central Indiana. Those are 16-row wide plots. You can see, and it's a nitrogen trial, you might imagine. And so there's a 16 rows by essentially a quarter-mile long. This happens to be a hog manure application situation where the grower is simply wanting to learn, what does the impact of that hog manure have on the nitrogen fertilizer that he should apply to that crop. And so we were putting in some trials to look at that on this farm. But again, the precision ag technologies allow us as researchers to design the trial ahead of time using the software. It allows us to implement and conduct field scale trials that are statistically sound. And you know us researchers in statistics, we get pretty nitpicky about doing things right statistically. And back in the old days, when we couldn't really do it easily because of the logistics for the grower, we just couldn't get sound data because we couldn't really construct the trial, design the trial like we want to. Well, now the technologies allow us to design statistically robust designs and allow us then to analyze the trials like we want, at the same time minimizing the logistical headaches for the growers. And in many cases, we can design trials that are almost seamless for the grower. When we're using prescriptions for the inputs and just harvesting yield monitors, and basically the planting and side dressing and harvest operations are just like you'd always do. It just so happens it's part of a trial, and yet it's very few logistical headaches for the grower. Yield monitors were the first part of that technology that allowed us to get serious about doing some of these trials, primarily because it allowed us to get away from the need for using weigh wagons at harvest time. And it allowed us to go to even bigger plots because we weren't restricted by the size of the weigh wagon on what we're harvesting. And so these monitors reduced the harvest logistics for the grower of getting involved with this kind of field scale research. It enabled us to use these larger plots. It enabled us to harvest almost without stopping. instead of harvesting a plot, unloading, weighing, harvesting a plot, unloading, weighing, and all that Mickey Mouse, we can just harvest the field nonstop after the monitor's calibrated. It allowed us to use odd-shaped fields, which was nice because in the old days, we would measure off the length of the plot and calculate the area that we harvested and use that to calculate yield. And the odd length plots were a pain in the butt because this one's 400 foot and that one's 450. And well, now we don't have to worry about that. Using yield data allows us to remove squirrely data. The fancy term is anomalous data, but frankly, there's squirrely data in the fields. It may be the wet hole that affected these 2 plots, but not the other 12, and so it makes sense to extract or remove the yield data from that wet hole. So it allows us to do that kind of yield data cleaning. And in these large-scale fields that almost always have some kind of spatial variability in them, different soil types, different elevation, whatever, it allows us, where it's appropriate, to look at the yield, use the yield data after the fact, extracted by, let's say, this soil type versus that one, and look at the yield responses individually within those soil types, because that often allows us to address variable management or site-specific management with the data. I still have colleagues on campus, those that we sort of facetiously call the real researchers, compared to us who are just doing this, practical stuff out in the field. The real researchers often look at these yield monitors and they say, you can't use those, they're not accurate enough. You can't dial them in accurate enough. It just can't work. Well, it does work, and proper calibration can limit the error rates on the grain weight estimates to 1% or less. And that's a screenshot off the monitor from that combine after we'd calibrated. We have an average error of 0.2% and a maximum of 0.4. And I dare say that's as good as anyone's going to get who are real researchers, And so the point is, we can get accurate data. Now, if you don't calibrate, that's a whole different ballgame. And so we do get a little anal about calibrating that monitor before we start harvesting the plots, and that sometimes creates some logistical headaches because you either need a decent weigh wagon or a grain cart with scales or a nearby enough farm scales to do the job. But once it's calibrated and dialed in, I am perfectly confident of the accuracy of the data that we're getting off these field scale trials. As I mentioned, these large fields have all sorts of natural variability, and that allows us to extract and look at the differences in yield response by each of the areas in the field, so that maybe we can decide if variable rate seeding is appropriate or whatever. So this is a 150-acre plant population trial. And you can see in the background those colored rectangles. They actually go the length of the field. Those are 16-row wide rectangles going essentially almost a mile through. And the neat-looking colors on top is actually the yield map. But it's the yield map after I've merged it with the soil type map. And now what I'm showing you, the colors represent the soil types. It's still the data points of the yield. So somewhere else in those little dots is the yield data and the moisture data and everything else, but I've merged it with the soil map, so then now I've assigned the soil map to every yield data point in that field, and I can illustrate and show you, and I think there's 7 different soil types in that 150 acres. And so in terms of a plant population trial, it allows us then to extract all the data from the purple soil type, all the data from the blue soil type, et cetera, and look at yield response to population within each soil type. This could be elevation, it could be varus, it could be whatever zone you want to come up with. These large-scale trials allow us to extract the data, and actually, essentially, we've got 7 trials for the price of 1. In this field with 7 large soil types. Okay, so again, for us to look at things like variable rating, it gives us the ability to actually see whether there's different yield responses within these different zones in the field. Variable rate controllers for trials that say include nitrogen rates or seeding rates or something like that. they allow us to use pre-designed prescriptions for those variable rates that are then uploaded to the controller. And so in the case of a population trial, we create the seeding rate prescriptions that are these nicely colored rectangles. And in this field, these are 12-row plots. It's a nitrogen trial. 6 randomized N rates for side dressing, replicated 5 times through the field and nicely randomized. And if you're going to do that manually, to go in and change the rates manually, and oh, by the way, I want you to put this rate here and here and here, it's a pain in the butt. And so people would never play with us back in the 80s and 90s because it was a pain in the butt. Well, now we hand them a prescription and say, just go out and side dress. And the controller is going to change it for you as you go through the field. The controller is going to replicate it. The controller is going to randomize it because we told it what to do. And so all you do is side dress. And suddenly there's no headache really whatsoever. You can do it without stopping and without the need for auto steer. On the other hand, if you don't have variable rate controls, we can still use the technology to simplify life for you a little bit because it can allow us to implement these randomized treatments a little more Mickey Mouse, but it's doable. And so, for example, in this same field, if we didn't have a variable rate controller, we'd start off with rate number 1, and we'd have a nice little table, and we'd say, okay, we know that swath number 4 is going to be this rate, and the next rep is swath number 10, the next one's 21, and we'll just drive through the field looking for the swaths on the monitor and putting in the rates, and when we get done, climb out of the cab, change the rate, and work our way back. It's a bit more of a nuisance, but it still makes it doable. And we've got some growers that'll work with us to do this kind of thing, simply using auto steer to put in the randomized reps of different rates in a trial like that. We gather a lot of data when we do field operations. We gather a lot of as-applied data logs. And so this is the as-applied data for the nitrogen applications in this field. And it allows us to document, did the applicator actually do what we wanted it to do based on the prescriptions? And it helps us document whether there were some screw-ups maybe in the application. Are there errors, or did we nail it with what we wanted? And so this works for planters, fertilizer applicators, chemical sprayers, anything that's logging the data. We can look at it later and just verify, okay, the treatments are what we wanted, the trial is good, or in some cases we discover, oh crap, the flow meter was sort of coughing all the way through the field and wasn't doing a good job. And we had a situation like this this year where we lost, in a field where we had about 10 replicates of a trial, we lost about 4 of the replicates because at that point, some point during planting, the flow meter started kicking out on us, and so the data told us that we did not have a good trial anymore. So it helps us as researchers verify if things went like they were supposed to. So the one thing I'll say, can say about on-farm research with these field scale plots, it's easy. Right? There's no question it is easy to do it. However, it does require some smarts. And maybe the better thing to say is it simply requires attention to detail, a willingness to maybe bend a little bit with us researchers who sort of get nitpicky and we really get a little anal about some things. But it's relatively easy to do, and we've had pretty good luck with it. This graph tries to show you what both sides bring to the party and to make on-farm research successful. And so from a farmer's perspective, obviously the farmer is contributing the land, the farmer is contributing the equipment, and any fancy whistles and bells that are on that equipment in terms of precision ag. The farmer hopefully has an interest in the trial. Without that, the trial has a high risk of failure if it's not a question that the farmer is really interested in. And the farmer brings a little bit of patience to it because, again, sometimes us researchers are a little hard to live with. And the farmer brings the attention to detail to all the operations that are going on to make sure that things are done right. As researchers, we bring our skills as researchers to the table. We bring our willingness to come out and scout fields and take all the appropriate notes during the season. We bring our skills at collecting data, and maybe as much as anything, we bring along our skills in analyzing the spatial data and working with all that with our GIS software. So both parties are bringing different things to the table. And if that all is done nicely, that on-farm trial is going to be successful. Now, it's easy. It requires attention to detail. It should also not be done willy-nilly. And I think this slide is maybe aimed more for those of you who want to do this on your own without any help by the likes of me. Understand you can't go about this kind of on-farm research willy-nilly. It requires some mindset about the scientific method, which if you've not had experience with that, it just doesn't come natural. So let me walk you through sort of what the scientific method is and what us researchers sort of get anal about. Clearly the question is an important thing. You know, what on earth are you trying to answer? And you'd be amazed, actually, when we bring in new graduate students and at some point we say, now, what's the question? What are you trying to answer in your research? You'd be amazed at sometimes how hard it is for the student to come up with a clear definition of the question. And so I just offer this as a challenge to you also, because part of that question is, well, then what's your hypothesis? All right, and so those two go hand in hand, and once you've got the question and the hypothesis sort of in your mind, then you can think of, okay, what are the meaningful treatments? I mean, let's just not throw any treatment out there willy-nilly, but what are the treatments that will really answer the question and maybe address the hypothesis? And so then once we have the treatments in mind, then we can plan and implement the research. And this is where, again, if you don't have skills or experience as a researcher, doing this sort of the experimental design clearly does not come naturally. There are some simple ways to do it, but that is part of this whole procedure. And then, of course, we're collecting data, not just yield data, but we collect data, we take notes all season long. And then at some point we analyze the data, and this is, if you're doing it on your own, this also gets to be a bit of a challenge. Because, again, a lot of us just don't have, well, we either don't have the experience analyzing data, or more frequently, we don't have the software to do it on the farm. And once we analyze the data, we interpret the results, and even that can get a little tricky on interpreting results and requires a real critical view. And then we repeat. And the reason we repeat research is to look for consistency in different growing environments. And so we do a variety trial this year, and we say, man, we topped out at 35,000. And then we just quit, and we run off, and that's what we start doing. Whereas if we'd repeat that over either 5 or 10 different fields, or several years in a couple fields, we might come up with a different answer. And maybe it's not 35,000, maybe it's 30, or maybe it's 40. But the point is, we repeat it to look for consistency. That's why we get so sort of anal about that. And eventually, we finish. And if research is any good at all, it always leads to more questions. And so then we start the process over. This is the so-called scientific method, which is what us as researchers bring to the table if you play with us. Because we're experienced with this, we know what we're doing. And again, just to re-emphasize why we repeat research, these are yield maps from a 30-acre field in 4 consecutive years. The legend is in the middle, and you can't read it in the back. The point is, red in one year means the same thing as red in another. So the legend is the same every year. And so 4 consecutive years, you see how much variability we get in yield just in one field. The reason we repeat research is that we get different growing conditions every year. And so we repeat it to see, do the treatments do the same thing no matter what the growing condition? Okay? And that's an important concept to get in mind, because we're looking at genetics by management, by environment interactions. And maybe you've seen that phrase before. Basically, what's the consistency of responses to the treatments we're interested in across a range of growing conditions? So you can't just do a one and done kind of on-farm trial. You either do several fields and years on your own, or you get some neighbors to go along with you and put out similar trials, within a county, within a region, so that you get a lot of data in 1 year. But if you're in a broad enough geographic area, you might get a range of growing conditions, one part of the county to another. So we're really trying to manage this genetics by management by environment kind of interaction. So again, I emphasize avoid the lone wolf mentality of doing on-farm research just by yourself. Avoid that. You might learn something of interest to yourself, but the power of on-farm research doesn't come from what you learn from your trial. Because you can't sample, you cannot conduct the trial in enough growing conditions to be confident that you're looking at repeatable kind of treatment effects. And when you do 1 or 2 trials, you're only sampling 1 or 2 possible future growing conditions. And with today's climate change and the effect on variable weather 1 year to another, this business of looking for repeatability is more important now than it ever has been. And so the power of on-farm research lies when we can aggregate results from a number of trials in a region, in a county, whatever, that allow us to develop more reliable recommendations for that broader geographic area. All right, so that's really the secret. That's the power of on-farm research, coupled with, I guess I should say, research that we're also doing at university farms that are in the same area. But that's the power, as we're trying to get as much sampling of the range of growing conditions as we can in order to decide whether this treatment or this management practice truly is better than the others that we're comparing against. So the process of getting involved with on-farm research begins with discussions between the growers and us about what are the objectives of the trial, what are the questions, what's the hypotheses, what are the logistics involved. And that's the big thing when we're doing on-farm trials is, I try as much as I can to make the logistics for my growers as simple as I can. And there are times where at the end of that discussion, we just finally mutually agree that, hey, it's not going to work for you. There are just too many headaches for you, and I'm not going to put you through it unless you have a burning interest in the question. And if you have a real burning interest about what we're doing, then you might be willing to do some of the headaches. But if it's too much for you, fine and dandy. We'll walk away, we'll shake hands, we'll be friends, and I may even buy you a beer sometime, but And so we're looking at what are the available fields that you might have, and so we sort of need to get a feel for the lay of the land. What equipment do you have, especially what kind of operating widths do you have, and how do they match up to give us the plot size? What kind of whistles and bells do you have on technologies that'll simplify your life more so than mine? And then if we're feeling good as we get through those, then we start actually getting to the point of selecting a field and selecting the set of treatments and making the decisions on plot size and general design. And so this is the kind of discussion that goes on between the growers and us about objectives and logistics. A few quick definitions, because people sometimes use words differently, and I just want to make sure you know what I mean when I talk about plots versus trials. So for us, the plot is the individual treatment, the individual 16-row wide by length of field plot. And so in this example, an individual plot would be treatment 1 or treatment 2 or treatment 3 in this layout. And again, they may be 16 rows wide by length of field. So that's an individual treatment, whereas the trial is the whole blessed thing. And sometimes, and this is a simple kind of statement to make, but people sometimes use these words interchangeably. So just understand, when I say we're dealing with 80-acre trials, it's 80 acres of the whole blessed thing. And when we're talking about 16-row plots, it is the individual treatments is what we're dealing with, or 12-row plots. In terms of size of trials that are desirable, there probably is no one kind of size. Typically, we're looking at field acreages that allow us to put in somewhere between 15 and 35 individual plots. The trials themselves, as I've already indicated, range from maybe 30 to 80 acres for most of them. And contrary to public opinion, the beauty of field scale research is that bigger fields is better than smaller. And this is contrary to the way that a lot of us were brought up as graduate students, thinking that you need these small uniform field areas to eliminate all the background noise. As it turns out, the bigger fields are actually better. And I've never been able to explain it statistically, but the point is I get statistically better data off these 50-acre trials that I do off my small postage stamp size trials at the Purdue farm. And it is literally better data. We can distinguish between treatments more easily. The background noise is less. And so bigger is usually better than smaller. And in fact, me and my colleagues are often accused of being land barons because we're going after all the big fields at the outlying Purdue farms and trying to get as many of them as we can to work with. The length of the trial is normally the length of the field. I don't like to cut up big fields and say put in 400 long plots in a quarter-mile long field. I prefer to use the whole length of the field. And I will accept fields that are maybe as short as 300 feet, but much shorter than that you run into some issues with how you process the yield data and how much data we typically remove off the front and the back end of a plot. And we've had them as long as a mile. There's really no maximum on the length, I suppose. The individual plot width is usually compatible. We try to make it compatible with the other field equipment used in the trial. Typically, the plot width is twice the width of the combine header because what we try to do is harvest the middle of a plot for trial data, and the in-betweens are bulk, especially if we're doing like nitrogen rates or something where there may be some bleeding over between plots. We try to harvest the middle of that plot for the trial data and leave the in-betweens we'll harvest it, but it's just going to be bulk. And in practice, this is one of our Purdue farms, so we have, I guess, the time to harvest all the middles first, and then when we're done with that, they come back and glean off the in-betweens. In practice, on a true on-farm trial, the farmer just harvests across the field. And then later, with the software, I'll extract the every other pass for data. All right. So the farmer can just harvest straight across the field. On the Purdue farms, we dink around taking out the middles first, and we seem to have all the time in the world to do this kind of thing. So, but anyway, the plot width is typically about twice the width of the combine header. Trials are often designed in a way that we call randomized complete blocks. Blocks is another word for reps or replicates. And so in this simple little design, there are 3 blocks or 3 replicates of the trial. Those are the ones the arrows are pointing to. And then within each rep are the treatments. And so rep number 2, you've got treatments 1, 2, and 3. Their sequence is random because we just need to do that. And rep number 1 above it has the same 3 treatments, and rep number 3 below it has the same 3. So those are the reps, and this is a usual kind of design that we use. And then, as I indicated, the treatment sequence is randomized within each rep because we want to avoid any possible bias of the treatment sequence being 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so we just randomize them. And the technologies, especially the variable controller technologies, allow us to make that seamless for you as the grower. And again, we replicate treatments in the trial. First of all, to allow us to do the statistics, which doesn't mean anything to you because you're not involved with that, but for us it allows us to do the mathematics. For the practical way of saying why we need reps is that it allows us to determine whether any treatment effects we think we're seeing are repeatable in the field. So if hybrid number 1 in rep number 1 is better, we'd like it to be better in rep number 2 and rep number 3 also. And that's why we do replicates. We're looking for consistency, we're looking for repeatability, and that's also why we repeat the trial over locations or over years, is we're looking for this repeatability. So let me give an example of inconsistent effects. And this is a nitrogen fertilizer timing, application timing. This was a trial we did with a grower who had his own Hagee with a nitrogen toolbar. And then we also got the co-op to come in with their Hagee and a wide drop. And so we wanted to look at effects of application timing on yield using the same total amount of N, but just split up into different timings. The V3, V9, V12 represent the times of application relative to growth stage. So we had one treatment that we had 172 pounds applied at V3 with the toolbar, and then that was it. We had another treatment where 122 pounds of it was on at V3 and the other 50 was put on at V9. The H stands for the Hagee toolbar. The YD stands for the wide drop. It's neither here nor there. These are the means for the, where'd my, there it is. It's there somewhere. All right. So this column, this is the, well, I didn't want you to show you that. This is the means of the 3 reps. When I give you a report of the trial, this is all I show you. Because we got the reps and we use it to calculate the means, and then we run the statistics and calculate some of the things like the CV of the trial and the LSD and whatever. And so these are the means, and you see differences, don't you? It ranges from 218 bushel to 225. So what, you're looking at a 7 bushel spread. It seems impressive when you look at it, and you might be tempted to think that this last treatment of 92 pounds applied at V3 followed by 80 pounds with the wide drop at V12, you might be tempted to think that that's one of the better treatments. And the other one above it, 122 early and 50 pounds late with the Hagee at 224, maybe that's another good one. Right? But when you look at the individual reps, and what I've highlighted for you here is within each rep I've highlighted the low yielding treatment and the high yielding treatment, and I just want you to see how they bounce around. Right? The effects are inconsistent. We're using reps to look for repeatability. I would like for the green highest yielding treatment to be the same one in every rep, and they're not. The last one in rep number 1, I don't know why this isn't working. So the 224, 223, 241, 3 different treatments and 3 different reps. That's not very consistent. The same with the lowest yielding one. 3 different treatments were the lowest yielding in every rep. What we're doing with reps is looking for repeatability. And so when we get done analyzing this, the upshot of it is we conclude there's no difference between these treatments. Even though mathematically there's 7 bushels, when we look at the reps, we got to say, hey, they're so flopping around just by dumb chance there's a 7 bushel spread at the end. This is why we're doing reps, all right? And again, you don't need to worry about the statistics, but just to understand why we do this kind of thing. Again, we use randomization to simply reduce the chances that something out there in the field might influence a treatment unfairly. And so I'll leave that at that. So giving a little idea of my workflow on how I design trials. This is a 30 or 40 acre field. And actually the Google map, you're looking at a Google map background. It's sort of actually fun for us as researchers as Google updates their background maps. It's sort of fun that we actually see our trials once in a while scattered around the state. So this was actually an earlier year of a trial in this field where we had big blocks of starter only treatments in this field. But we're going to put a different one on top of it. So I use, and I'm not promoting FarmWorks, I'm just saying that I use FarmWorks as my tool to design the trial. It's got some, you got to cheat in a way to use some tools that aren't meant to be used this way, but it actually works pretty good. And so it's got a tool called the buffer tool in FarmWorks that once I have the field boundary, you can barely make out the red field boundary on that field. Once I've got the field boundary, I can use this buffer tool and actually create the plots. It's really slick, it's really sweet, and allows me to lay that trial in and I know it fits. I can do the end rows and everything. And so once I've got the trial laid in there with the FarmWorks, then I can go in and I can assign the reps, I can assign the randomized treatment, and then I color them so I can see it. These are the 4 reps, or actually there's 4 reps I guess of that trial. And then eventually I randomize the sequence of, in this case I think it's a nitrogen trial. And so I do all this in FarmWorks. and design it ahead of time. In fact, I should be home doing it now instead of talking to you, because I've got a lot of trials to do work on over the next couple weeks. But this is what I'm doing in the winter season, is designing trials, using the software, the GIS software to do it. And then when it's appropriate, let's say it's a fertilizer rate trial or a seeding rate trial, then I take this map and I simply export it as a prescription file suitable for your monitor. And most monitors will take just sort of generic shape files as an import, and so I can export to almost any controller that's out there. And once it's in your controller, you just do whatever it is. You just plant, you just side dress, you just whatever. So I take care of building all this ahead of time. Now, I talked about doing plot notes and data scouting. And this is really our responsibility as researchers. We don't ask you to collect a lot of this data during the season. We do like to get the log files for the seeding or fertilizer from you so we can look for mistakes in particular. But then we try to get out there as much as we can during the season to do our manual kind of scouting. We use our drones to get aerial imagery, partly to look for treatment effects with aerial imagery, but partly to look for the weird spots in the field that I may want to know about when I clean the data later. And so we're collecting a lot of data, doing a lot of field scouting. At least that's our goal every year, is to do that kind of scouting. And then, of course, I've already talked about these yield monitors, how they allow us to take advantage of larger fields and larger equipment, and the fact that if they're calibrated, they are perfectly acceptable as research tools. If they're not calibrated, they're crap, but they can be calibrated. I've yet to come across one that I can't calibrate down to the level that I want. And once they're calibrated, they are extremely accurate on what they're estimating in the field. Now, after the fact, once I've got the yield data in my possession, then I'll just show you sort of my general workflow after that point. This is an 80-acre trial we had. This was another application timing trial that we had up in Miami County. So an 80-acre trial. I happen to use Ag Leader SMS. Again, I'm not promoting that. I'm just saying Ag Leader SMS is one of the most compatible softwares to read data files from a lot of different monitors, which is important to me because I deal with almost every brand of yield monitor out there, and I need a software that will import any of them. And so for me, Ag Leader SMS is one that's pretty good at that. And with Ag Leader, then, what I'm using it for is the initial processing. And when we talk about yield data processing, we're talking about making sure the GPS offset is correct. We're making sure that we're accounting for the number of seconds that it takes for the grain, once it hits the header, to go through the machine and hit the sensor. And so we're adjusting for that. And so we do this initial kind of processing with SMS, and then we export that into simply a shape file. And then this is something I'm sort of interested in. There's several ways to clean the data once you've processed it, and by cleaning the data, I wish my thing worked. When we have big trials like this, and I've got these small areas of crap, a wet hole or a drown out or something. For research purposes, when I'm looking at treatment effects, I want to get rid of things that are influencing plots unfairly. All right? Now, you on your own farm, there's not much reason to remove these kind of weird spots on your own. In fact, you want those weird spots because when you're trying to increase yields in your field, you want to find those low yielding spots and then start focusing on those to figure out why they're low yielding. To a certain degree, as a researcher, I could care less why they're low yielding. They're in my way, and so I go in with GIS software and get rid of these. And there's a USDA program called Yield Editor that is sort of a how do I say it? It's a close your eyes and do it kind of program. And you can use default settings, and it'll go in and remove all these unusual kind of areas sort of on. I prefer to know what I'm removing, so I use an open source GIS program called QGIS that allows me to clean the yield data, and once I've got it cleaned, I take that underlying plot layer that I've created and I literally merge them together so that I can attach the plot, the rep, the treatment to every data point in that field, and I can use this open source software to do that. And then I export that into a file that I can bring into Excel that allows me to simply summarize that yield data into plot means that I use for later analysis. And then I use a pretty robust statistical package called SAS to actually analyze the data. This is one of the sort of brick walls for growers doing your own trial and wanting to do statistical analysis. There aren't many off-the-shelf packages that are cheap and intuitive for you to use out in the real world. And so this, again, is something we bring as researchers to the table, is usually we've got access to these kind of packages to run the analyses for you. And again, both the data cleaning and the statistical analysis are usually stumbling blocks for folks that are working on their own. A lot of the software is pretty expensive, and if you don't have experience working with it, it can be a royal pain. And again, this skill and the software is what we usually bring to the table when we're playing together, working with these on-farm trials. There are challenges with this. I won't pretend that there aren't. While I say I can handle a lot of variability in fields, and in fact I say that I sort of want variability in fields because I want to look at some of the spatial kind of analyses, nevertheless sometimes it gets overwhelming. And it can get excessive, and we occasionally do abandon trials just because there's so much crap that's happened, we can't get good data out of it. But I will say it's a rarity when we have to abandon a trial. We don't have that many over the years that we've had to give up. Usually I can either clean the data to get rid of some things like wet holes and still have enough data there. Sometimes we find it difficult recruiting collaborators to work with us, or finding ones that have particular fields or maybe particular management attributes that are relevant to the trial. So as researchers, sometimes that's a challenge for us to find people who are willing to play with us and have the right set of characteristics. Sometimes the equipment availability or compatibility is a challenge. That huge 400-acre trial I mentioned earlier, that was so fun to do. It happened to be a row width trial. The grower had an 80-foot 30-inch planter and a 40-foot 15-inch planter, and he had both planters. The 15-inch was a homemade, and the 80-foot was what they used. But he had this 400-acre field, and he was curious about these ultra-narrow rows, and he had the equipment. And because it was 15-inch rows, we could harvest it with a 30-inch head, sort of carefully, but we could do it. And so that was one of the few instances I've had to do a field scale row spacing trial. Because usually getting both planters is hard to get, and if it's, say, a 20-inch head versus a 30, and then you need a second head to boot, the logistics of lining up equipment sometimes to do field scale trials, it just can't be done. And so that can be a challenge doing some of what we want to do. These precision ag technologies, as cool as they are, they've all got their little quirks and inadequacies, and they sometimes don't play well with each other, and compatibility is an issue, and so that can be a challenge sometimes doing these trials. And then for us as researchers, where we would like to go collect some really detailed data, when we're in plots that are 16 rows wide by half a mile long, the labor and the time it requires to try and do that kind of manual data collection is just overwhelming. And so that's one of the things we sort of give up when we're doing these field scale trials, is the ability to collect a lot of manual detailed data, and that's just sort of the balance that we have to deal with. That's one of the reasons we're interested in drones and getting the aerial images of the whole field and using the reflectance data as sort of a proxy for some of the manual data that we collect. And so that's why we're looking hard at drone imagery on these field scale trials to see if we can actually use the imagery as data and actually work it into the analyses of the trials. We began in earnest with field scale trials back in 2006. with the simple objective of addressing important crop inputs for Indiana growers, ones that were important dollar concerns, and at the time, nitrogen fertilizer and seed represented about half the variable cost of production for our growers. And inputs that are that high, that strong of a variable cost, we wanted to make sure that our guidelines on fertilizer rates and seed rates were accurate, because when seed's running $3 to $4 a thousand, you just can't afford to be planting more than you need, and the same with nitrogen. So we got in with those two topics. We started with those, and partly because our guidelines were a bit out of date. And we wanted to involve county extension and local CCAs in these collaborative trials. So there was that desire there to get more people involved with it. So since 2006, and it's mostly, and what I'm showing you here is mostly what Jim Cambrato and I have done. Jim's our soil fertility guy, and he and I worked on a lot of these together. So since 2006, Jim and I have been involved with more than 250 nitrogen trials, close to 100 population trials, 32 starter fertilizer trials, 16 trials looking at biological in-furrow seed treatments, and about 12 trials looking at sulfur fertilizer with corn. And again, these on-farm research collaborations, they not only give us more data for the database, but they allow us to broaden, maybe more importantly, they allow us to broaden the geographic extent of where we're doing the research. The red dots are the Purdue outlying research farms. And if we were only doing trials at the Purdue farms, we'd be missing out on a lot of areas of the state. The yellow counties are the ones where we've done some of these trials, and so it simply allows us to reach out to more soils, different growing conditions around the state by getting growers involved with some of these trials. A few last things before I finish up. We've approached the field scale research by focusing on a few number of topics, the ones that I just showed you, and with the goal of getting as much data as we can on those few topics to help us build the guidelines. And that's been the goal or the objective that we've had. And so we've not had 20 or 30 or 40 different questions or topics. We've focused on a few and really tried to build some good guidelines. These trials have been primarily funded by a combination of corn checkoff dollars in the state as well as some internal Purdue funding. Because neither of those are big dollar items for us, we've never been able to compensate growers for any yield loss or profit loss that they've had because of collaborating on the trial. So if we're doing a nitrogen trial and we encourage them to put in a rate that's lower than adequate and they lose yield, we don't compensate them. We don't have the money to, never have, probably never will. And we've worried about that. But what we think has happened is that because we don't have any money to pay people for losses, we end up with growers who play with us who really want to play. They really have a question. They really have the interest. They really want to learn. And they're willing to lose some money, possibly in the trial, in return for learning something that's going to make them boatloads of money in the rest of their operation. And so the guys who play with us have a burning interest in the question. They have a burning interest to learn. And because of that, they tend to be really good with attention to detail. Because they're doing, frankly, the bulk of the work, right? They're doing the planting, the fertilizer applications, the harvesting. We rely on them to really help us do a good job with all those operations. And so we end up getting guys who are really good at paying attention to what they do. These trials have supported, I've also had colleagues that say, oh, you can't do graduate student research on farm trials. You just can't do it. It's not, I don't know, it's not detailed enough or it's not good enough. Our trials over the past 13 years, we've supported the research of 12 of our graduate students with these trials and one postdoc who's a postdoc is someone who's got their PhD and in between a real job and their degree, they do some research, and they're called postdocs. But we supported a lot of graduate student training with these field scale trials, so we feel pretty good about what we can do with it relative to graduate students. Because Jim and I are both strong extension responsibilities, we've been able to disseminate this information over a wide area of the state in many different ways. And so we feel good about that we've been able to get this information out not only to our collaborators but to the whole state, because again, our goal is to develop robust guidelines for the entire state or regions of state, and we've been able to generate a lot of that visibility in a lot of different ways. And I'll just leave you with this, that field scale research, working with growers, it clearly takes a village. When we combine what we can do at Purdue's farms with field scale trials with what we can do with growers, it allows us to generate these large data sets over a wide range of growing conditions and do that faster and end up then giving us the ability to generate guidelines that our growers and clientele believe are more credible. And frankly, it's credible partly because a lot of the data comes from real farms. And I've heard this complaint ever since I started in 1982 that what we do on the Purdue farms is not real or credible because it's not real farms. Well, now we can include real farm data in these trials, okay? And I think with that, that's all I got, and actually finished pretty good. If there's any questions, I can visit with you one-on-one or whatever. And those of you that are Indiana farmers and want to think about playing with us, send me an email. You guys in Ohio, I'll let you play with your own people in Ohio. But anyway, that's what I got to say, and hopefully there's something there of interest to you. And with that, who's ever in charge, I'll stop and turn it back.